Hey guys, this is John from Gadion Corp. Today I'm going to be discussing a review of the CFA curriculum. So I just received the passing report for the level 3 exam a few days ago. So I've been waiting to do this. Basically, the way this is going to get structured is I'm going to answer a number of questions that have not really been answered well, I feel, on the internet, and we'll obviously go over a quick primer on what exactly is the CFA curriculum, or what are some of the basic facts of it. So we're going to go answer these questions, and we're going to go over some studying tips in particular. One thing that's worth maybe mentioning, I suppose, is that I do have a background in neuroscience and not in finance, and in particular, some of the research that I've done was on learning and memory and the neurobiology in that area. So hopefully that will improve my ability to provide good insights in this area in particular. And then we'll go over coverage of the curriculum, basically just the curriculum content. That'll include some things like the table of contents for the third level. Go into the portfolio management pathway in particular in a little bit more depth. And I'm also going to make some comparisons to other texts as well to describe, for example, how detailed is the CFA curriculum actually. Because questions like that have also been answered somewhat poorly on the internet as well. One thing that is worth mentioning is I do strongly feel after, so first I would say this. I did not get a prep provider. I purely read the textbooks for all three levels. And for me, a big reason for that was just, getting broad coverage of everything included in the curriculum. I'm concerned that a lot of the people talking online either do not actually do that, which is fine, but then I don't think that it's fair for them to say, okay, well, this stuff was not in the curriculum, for example. Or they might just not even be doing it. And maybe as an alternative third hypothesis, right? One thing that could be the case is that they simply wrote the exam at a different time when some of these things were not covered. Because the CFA exam has not only gotten harder over the years, despite what some people have been saying online. We know based on the statistics that on average the passing rates are going down for all three levels over a longer historical period, but also that the textbooks are getting significantly longer. And that's not necessarily the case of last year's, compared to the year before. So for example, when I wrote the level 1 exam, there was about 3,600 pages of material in there, and then total volume for the entire curriculum was about 9,000 pages, give or take. And then I think when I went to go and check the curriculum for the level 1 last year, I think it actually was reduced to like 3,400 or something like that. In any case, it fluctuates, right? Because they find new ways to deliver information. They remove some content, add new content, etc. Right? So that could be another explanation. But as of the most recent, this is going to be the most recent information on the topic, I suppose. Okay, so what is generally covered and in how much detail? So we're just going to quickly, so for question 1, we're just going to quickly go over some of the content. Basically, this is the CFA curriculum core. So you do have the textbooks at the level 1, 2, and 3, and then you have practical skills modules now, which can be accessible at different levels. So for example, analyst skills and machine learning and Python are both offered at level 2, and portfolio management is offered at level 3 exclusively. Now, basically, it just covers very broadly everything that you would need to know to handle investments, but it really does a lot more than that. So although it's useful for investments, really where you get very much into portfolio management is with level 3, and you can see that level 3 is kind of just dedicated to that. Things like asset allocation and derivatives and risk management, for example. those are all really just related to portfolio management. And we'll talk about ethics later, but whereas the level 1 and level 2 are much more broad in their coverage and get a lot, like very much so, away from the portfolio management side of things on a lot of topics. So for example, quant at level 1 is largely dedicated to just like basic statistics, I would say. So, introducing you to normal distributions and binomial distributions. I think binomial distributions is covered. And just getting into the start of linear regression. And then level 2 picks up from multi-linear regression. It does go into some machine learning, although, we'll discuss that in the math component later. Really just kind of requiring like summation notation. We'll get into that later. Okay. Then, econ. So fixed income, some of these other abbreviations, FI, fixed income, financial statement analysis, portfolio management, PM, and alternatives. Then the rest are pretty straightforward, right? A lot of these dedicated to investment instruments. One of the differences across level 1 to level 2 is that the level 2 is much more focused on, I would say, applying these things in a larger context. So, for example, equities at level 1 is largely about individual stock valuations, maybe based on like historical pricing models, just as one example. And equities at level 2 is largely dedicated to using the financial statements to, for example, come up with estimates for free cash flow at equity, for example, and use that in a DCF model to generate a equity valuation. So broader coverage. And then similar thing with level 1 to level 2. So for example, with a fixed income, for example, fixed income at level 1 largely deals with, the present value of cash flows, and you'll, learn things about IRR, for example. At level 2, you'll go over things like the binomial rate trees, for example. And other things like the Black-Scholes-Merton model, which it does split up into, differences between like Black-Scholes model and the Black model, for example. So you will have to know some of the differences there as well. But yeah. It's also worth noting, I'll answer that question later, but you don't really have to derive any of this stuff, to be honest. In how much detail? I would say generally, in terms of the mathematics, not very much detail. Like there's a lot of math, but it's kind of the way that like engineers would study math, where you kind of just have the endpoints given to you. So you're not really working a lot from the ground up. There's some of that. For example, at the level 1, you go through the Markowitz efficient frontier to develop your risky asset portfolio models, for example, like the CAPM. And in that case, right, it's sort of from the first principles, but other things are like, for example, the Black-Scholes model. You really don't have to know what geometric Brownian motion looks like on a mathematical perspective. Now, other stuff like, I would say, for example, the conceptual topics, though, are covered in very good detail. I think you'd be hard-pressed to really find any reason to add additional details to the conceptual layers. Even on, some of the less covered topics, like, let's say, corporate strategy, for example. And it's not to say that you cannot write an additional, several hundred pages about that. It's more about, with the information given to you, you can certainly infer, I think, all the rest. Yeah. Okay. So is there a comparison level of education? How accurate is the comparison? So generally, all 3 levels are compared to a master's degree in finance. Seems to me like the comparison is accurate. Might even be more. Some people have suggested it even is potentially more. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that it's very focused. When you go and take an undergraduate degree, it's going to be, for example, like take my neuroscience degree, right? A lot of my classes were not neuroscience. I took some genetics, for example. I took a lot of molecular genetics. I took some philosophy, for example. Like we have these like humanities context credits, for example. Everything here, all kind of just related to finance. So that's useful or like helpful at least in condensing the curriculum on a time scale. And then I would also say that based on the people that I have talked to with a finance degree, it seemed to me like the level 1 had covered, just to be honest, again, this is just my experience. And so I could be, of course, succumbing to things like small sample bias, for example. But it did seem to me like even the level 1 alone had conferred potentially an entire bachelor's degree worth of finance knowledge. And that isn't that surprising, honestly, in hindsight. It is 3,600 pages of information after all. Okay. And also, maybe one other thing too to mention is some people online have mentioned that it's like just you read books and then you don't practice it. Like, what are these people talking about? There's actually I even have an example of this. The amount of questions that you have, for example, that have you basically read financial statements, for example. And also now they have the very obvious practical skills modules. I think that statement is just sort of silly, to be honest. Okay, so moving on. Do you need a finance degree, and how difficult is it for non-finance degree holders? So I would say, personally, so when I started writing the level 1 or studying for level 1, honestly, I didn't even really know what a dividend was. I don't think, not like in precise detail, of course. So you have like some vague idea of what it is, but you don't really know. And for me, I did. I know that I am a particular kind of person, of course, as you'll see throughout the rest of the video. I did quite well on the level 1, certainly above the 90th percentile but yeah, quite well. Okay. And so obviously you don't need a finance degree, and I would say generally it's not going to hold you back. I would even say that, let me even say this. Okay, look, I wrote the level 1 without a background in finance, and I did that in a 4.5 month period while I was still working at Accenture at the time. So you can definitely do it and do quite well, frankly. So yeah, just don't worry about that. Okay, how much of a math background would I require? Not much, honestly. It would certainly help to have like basic calculus, like understanding literally just rates of change. You are not going to require integrals, I think, on anything here. And although integrals are very useful for other areas of financial math, so for example, in certain bond valuations when you are actually taking a financial math class. And aside from that, maybe summation notation. So of all the things you could actually have a background in, statistics is probably the most going to make things the easiest, I would say. There's a large part of the quant section dedicated to statistics and some machine learning. But even the machine learning, like let's take Bayesian inference, for example, it's not going to have you do any calculations of, like Bayesian inference over, let's say like multivariate Gaussian distributions, for example. You don't need integrals, is what I'm saying. Okay, cool. Or, another example, support vector machines get covered in the machine learning section of the level 2. You also don't even really have to know things like Euclidean distance, I think, to understand the way that it explains and asks you about hyperplanes and, the way that they separate points using support vector machine at the level 2 level. At the level 2 level, just for example, right? So you really don't need a lot of math. But you'll learn a lot of equations, just not a lot of math. Like you're not doing any functional analysis here. Just, okay, cool. Do you need a prep provider? I did not use one, as I alluded to earlier. I would say the only reason, going into maybe just the next question, why I would have personally used a prep provider is the question sets. So you can certainly, I think, reduce the amount of time that you have to spend going through the curriculum by getting a prep provider. Reading through the curriculum in detail, because again, you're not just reading, you are studying the curriculum. It's very different. And that's maybe how you should think of it, is you're studying the curriculum, not reading it. That takes about 300 hours, to be honest. Reading through the curriculum and doing all the questions takes about 300 hours. And I would say of that, probably about 50 of those hours are dedicated to like answering questions in the first pass through. So really most of it's the reading, because the reading, like it takes a long time to read 3,000 pages, right? Lecture videos from prep providers are generally about 100 hours per level. So significant time savings there, but also they provide lots of additional questions. Now, the reason why I'm not particularly interested in the condensed lectures is, I think, two reasons. One is that I do personally find lectures typically to be kind of boring. I think there's certainly something to be had from studying by oneself, because you have to come up with all the answers on your own. And I think that's and other people will probably agree with me in some respect, and although you can encounter issues doing that, I think if you want to have a deep understanding of things, that's the best way to do it. But it does take time. But if you want to be good at anything, you really have to put in a lot of time to get good at that thing. The other issue, so one, I don't find it enjoyable. Two is that it really does reduce the amount of content that you cover. You cannot expect to get a summary and have the same level of detail that you would from not a summary. So additionally, the curriculum does do a good job of bringing up past information, so you can kind of go across the books in whatever order you want, but it doesn't repeat itself so much that the entire books feel superfluous. So there's not a lot of, frankly, content that you could just cut and leave the same amount of information value there. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. I would recommend, honestly, like if you want to get very good at things, you should just self-study these things. So yeah, but it might not be feasible for you. So consider your situation, of course. Okay, will you get a job from this? In my experience, no. That's one of the reasons why we started this company. So, now, mind you, there's a few other factors that are at play. The first is that when I was, applying for jobs originally, I only had the CFA Level 2 done. The other sets of things to mention is that I did get interviews, but I won't talk about those because I went through, man. I went through some like very lengthy interview processes in some cases, and really didn't get any. Now, one of the problems though also is that the Canadian economy right now, as per everyone's knowledge, is under severe downward pressure, and it's been that way for pretty much since I was looking for a job. So that's a problem. Yeah. So will you get one? Maybe not. Unfortunately, there's not a clear answer. I think probably though. Talking with other charter holders, they have all pretty much unanimously agreed that the education component itself is the most significant aspect. in their opinion, of course. But I would intuitively concur with that based on the information available on education and experience and expertise, and just like general logic. So probably though, like I said, I did get those interviews even in the sort of like downward economy where they actually hiring. I don't have any idea. So okay, cool. Will the job be investment banking? No, absolutely not. You pretty much need to go and do an MBA based on everything that I've read about this in order to go and do that. So focus on that instead. Oh yeah, how much time do you really need to study? So technically, I think you could actually get away with 300 hours. I will say, I studied a lot more than 300 hours, but you don't have to, I don't think. So I am a strong believer in overstudying. A lot of people that you will talk to are just trying to barely pass. I do not like that. And I think it's frankly lazy. Yeah. So look, I mean, when I wrote the first mock exams at every level, okay, like I said, it took about 250, 300 hours to pass through the curriculums for the first time at each level. And so at the end of every first pass, I would then go and write a mock exam and kind of see where I'm at. On each of those mock exams, after the first pass through, I got what was probably going to be a passing score. Usually around. Surprisingly, this was surprising to me because it's hard to know how much you actually remember when you finish studying a big curriculum like this. But like around like 75s, yeah. So yeah, I think 300 hours you could get away with that. I think for sure. But I studied probably around like 600 hours for each exam. And I think that's a good thing. The more passes that you do through a curriculum like this, the better you'll understand the material. And so it's not just about, your score at the end of the day. It's about the abilities conferred to you via your understanding. And, one, proof of that, so to speak, is that, we have articles on this. I mean, it seems to me like I was well ahead on things like the AI bubble, for example, although I don't think that requires, a certain amount of expertise to assess. I do think it certainly helps. I was also apparently well ahead of the market crash that happened, I don't know, like 5 months ago now, due to the temporary pressure on the S&P 500 from the tariff situation. But in particular, that one's very interesting and instructive because the analysts at JP Morgan and Deloitte had both published at the time basically case scenarios for outcomes projected. And what I would say is that those case scenarios were just too optimistic. So the downside they'd put, and this is a traditional downside, they gave 25% chance to the worst case scenario. What did that worst case scenario actually look like? Well, I mean, entering the year, it looked like 25% chance Donald Trump implements one of his bad policies, economically speaking. And also that it felt like reading that, I was pretty sure that they did not fully reflect the impact of that. So anyways, that's all to say that it was very obvious to me at the time that volatility was going to be underpriced. And it certainly was. If you look at the shock to the VIX index once the tariff announcement had been made, it was very obvious that it was not priced into the market. And that's fine. Like, it doesn't require you to go through all this stuff to see it, but it, chicken or an egg scenario. But that's certainly how I approach things. And so I was able to see that. And these analysts who maybe did or not have that demeanor did not. And so, yeah, just saying. Okay, do the mock exams reflect the real exams? Yes. So there's some differences between the mock exams and the real exams. At level 1, it's very similar. At level 2, so people have said that it's easier. It's not exactly that. When you go to write the real exam, it's just less tedious. The experience is basically that the vignettes are just significantly shorter, it seemed to me, which is really how it should be. I'm not a fan of like reading through a lot of text. Now, in some cases, some of these questions, the actual vignettes themselves do teach you a little bit about, give you like maybe a bit of a review even on some topics, but it's just tedious. It's not more difficult. So yeah. It's also important to say this because I know that there's somebody online who, I get it, you got to make a living, but who's suggesting that the mock exams provided by the CFAI are free and therefore maybe aren't so good. Well, I mean, look, first thing, they're not free. They're complimentary. They come with the fact that you bought the curriculum. And the other is that they're from CFAI, which is the body that makes your final exam, obviously. So yeah, I would say they're certainly the most reflective, and that's definitely I think my definitive answer for that. Okay, can ChatGPT make good practice questions? I don't think so. No. Maybe if you ask it like one question at a time. But I only really tried this once because when I had asked it to make a list of questions for me to practice from for the level 2, I got a list that was shockingly bad. It was so bad I was I really did think that like basically a kid could have made better questions, to be honest with you. So it was very bad. I never used it again. Just my experience. ChatGPT does improve over time. First, the language models themselves get more tokens. As the next model comes out, I hear ChatGPT 6 is going to be sooner than, GPT 6 is going to be sooner in terms of like relative time lengths to publish each model. And that will certainly have more parameters attached to it, which also facilitates, it's what's called emergent abilities. So we may see it get better at coming up with practice questions in the future. Okay, what were the hardest sections on the actual exam? So it's interesting the difference between like studying for the exams and actually writing the exams. Or that on level 2, for example, ethics was clearly the hardest segment, and the problem is, with my experience writing ethics, just extremely particular, very particular, and so you have to know what what that handbook says. I'll say that. The other sections, like, so for example, I think the hardest section to study for the level 2, just as an example, I could pick the level 3. Level 3, I think derivatives was clearly the hardest section to study for. But level 2, I think fixed income was the hardest to study for, but just very big contrast on the exam. The fixed income questions on the exam were, I think, just very easy. So, yeah. Okay. And then, level 1, generally, it just didn't really have any real issues there. It's very broad, so you probably end up preparing a lot more than, honestly, you need to. Aside from ethics on level 2, there wasn't really anything that stood out as particularly difficult. Some sections like alternatives and quant were particularly easy for me, I would say. Some questions on derivatives on level 2 were difficult. It wasn't, I think, nearly as hard as people say. To be honest, I think the only like I don't even really know why people were saying that derivatives were so hard. To be totally honest, I think it's just a matter of memorizing the equations, and what they mean. So yeah, I can't even really say anything particular about level 3, by the way, because it's a lot less clear what the separations are. Like asset allocation is used in portfolio management, for example. So it's hard to know when you're even really like getting a question on portfolio management versus asset allocation on the actual exam. Generally, level 3 exam was easier than level 2. I think just honestly by far. And nothing was particularly stand out as difficult. I think that's all I will say about the level 3 exam. Moving on. And I didn't technically have an easy level 3 exam, by the way, like not by the pass rates either, but the level 2 exam I wrote was historically difficult, with I think a 39% pass rate for that exam. So maybe that explains why I felt, honestly, the AM exam for level 2 for me felt grueling. Okay, so how can I best study for it? So we're going to go over this actually in a separate segment. So like I said, my background is in neuroscience, and in particular, I had specialized in, largely learning and memory, although I was, trying to transition over to, more like a molecular genetics route before I left the university. Okay, so how do I read well and retain information? So first, like I said, I went through the reading route. I think that's a better way to do it, and also it creates independence for you. If you can pass an exam like this by reading the textbooks, then I think you can go and read all kinds of information in other places and be confident that you are learning. And so it helps you bring your education into your own hands, which I think is very cool. Very cool, for sure. Okay, so how do I read well and retain information? So, what I do when I read, and, you do see my notes sometimes when I do book reviews, is I make sure that I take lots of notes and I highlight information. A big part of retaining information is going to be, one, answering questions, but two, writing stuff down. I don't recommend that you write everything down, but sometimes you might have to. So, for example, I don't write down anything that I consider largely rudimentary or, just extremely easy to understand. But if I find it difficult to understand what I'm reading, then I will sometimes write stuff down, even just to break it down into, words that I understand. Which doesn't happen so much with the CFA curriculum, but, let's say you're studying like a math topic, like, semi-group homomorphisms. That might not be so easy to read about. So, yeah, you might have to break stuff down. And I do recommend, look, people say speed reading, it's not a thing. Speed reading is not a thing. Don't do it. Read every word and make sure it makes sense. Speed reading is not a thing. Don't do it. You'll waste your time. Read every word, write stuff down, make sure it makes sense. And then, aside from that, try to make sure that you actually conceptualize the information while you're reading it. So that might involve, picturing how it looks, thinking about how it applies to, your own life. So, for example, if you're reading the, portfolio management section, for example, in the level 3, you might want to think about, okay, well, how is this going to apply to my job? How can I use this when I'm managing my own portfolio? Something like that, right? So for me now, for example, because our company is going to be working on, I am making a robo-advisor soon. So if I were going through the, curriculum again, then I would think about how it applies to, that information, right? Like how would I use this in a robo-advisor setting? Okay, cool. And that's important. The more connections you can make to material, the easier it's going to be to retain. It's the same way that, information retention works. So something that a lot of people don't know is that if you know a lot of stuff, it's easier to remember more stuff. And the reason for that is that when you learn, you form new synaptic connections in your brain. And so you just have a larger network to work with, basically. Okay, cool. Moving on. How often should I review? I think once a week is fine, but it depends. So there's kind of a balance. What I would figure is that generally, if I'm reviewing, I want to do it kind of frequently so that I don't have to like reread everything in great detail to understand what was being said. Additionally, you probably want to focus more on question answering during a review process than reading. So there's that, doing it, frequently enough that you just kind of quickly go through it, and that you're not, I personally can hardly tolerate reviewing. I find it extremely boring. So even though I do it a lot, I just try to do like very short segment reviews because I don't want to be doing it for like 500 pages, for example. So I mean, like, reviewing every 200 pages, maybe the end of every book, something like that would probably be a good pace. Yeah. Does reading order matter? No, not at all. Which is another thing that people have said online that has just been untrue. The problem with even really bothering with the reading order, to be honest with you, aside from maybe the concern that you might just be trying to barely pass segments, in which case maybe you do need to strategize then and pick the hardest topics to go through first and the easiest topics to go through last. Is that if you're just gonna, like, if you're confident you're gonna get through the entire curriculum, then I wouldn't really bother with being concerned with the reading order, because the way that typical books, for example, work, and the same thing applies to the CFA curriculum, is that you are going to get references to prior information, and arguably the order presented is probably just the best way to go through it. Because, for example, in portfolio management, you're going to get references to asset allocation. Maybe it's a good idea to go through asset allocation before you go through portfolio management. Additionally, I think that things like performance management are probably easier to understand if you know asset allocation, and so on. So I'd probably just recommend you go through it in the recommended order, at least if you know that you're going to cover everything. Ethics, maybe you can always just put last. Yeah. Okay. Are lecture videos better than reading? So I kind of discussed this. Basically, it's just a trade-off between time and actual information content. Again, lecture videos are summaries, so I don't think you're going to know that as well. Additionally, I do just generally find that listening to people talk and like show stuff and stuff, I just find that all boring. So yeah, I prefer to read. Okay. How do I value retention months after doing practice question? Okay, so a few ways that you can maybe figure out, am I actually learning? So obviously the CFA curriculum itself provides, practice questions and mock exams, right, that you can do. But I mean, how do you actually like assess, let's say, if you don't have any of those things? Well, there's other things that you can do. I mean, you could try to do a project, for example. You could obviously go and review something later. You could go and revisit questions. Another thing that you can kind of do is, read through segments and see if it's, if there's just taking like the same amount of time as it did on the first go. And if it did, then you probably just didn't understand it. So you don't remember it very well, right? So those are some other ways to kind of evaluate that. Just, figure out if you are breezing through the information. This is becoming a very long video. I'm quite tired. Okay, anyways, some keys though. So these are some things that people don't know about trying to like learn stuff and developing lesson plans. So basically, you need to reduce stress, rest, and reduce boredom. Arguably, these are all just placed on the moniker, reduce your boredom. Sorry, pay attention. Pay attention. Oh, geez. Tired. Okay, so why pay attention? Because if you pay attention, you can better utilize your neuroplastic mechanisms in your brain governing, what you actually encode as a memory. If you don't pay attention, that's very hard because you need to filter out, automatically, basically your brain, filters out what is noise and what's, something that's worth focusing on. So if you're not paying attention, everything's just going to get thrown into the noise. So with that in mind, some caveats, such as reduced stress, for example. If you're stressed out, you are literally going to find it, one, difficult to pay attention, but two, what we notice in the hippocampus is that it doesn't utilize neuroplasticity. It doesn't encode memories, as well. So memory formation gets inhibited if you're stressed out. So you need to relax, reduce stress, and then, pay attention again. Rest, same thing, and reduce boredom, same thing. Just so pay attention. If you're not paying attention, figure out how to do that, and these are probably the major keys you need to focus on to do so. Okay. Aside from that, it's worth noting, maybe you should develop a structure for this and set goals maybe at the end of every week. I want to, I break my goals down into daily goals. So typically the way that I would study for, each level, for example, is I would have a morning goal and some evening goal when I was working at Accenture, for example. So that might look like, read 20 pages before I go to work, read 20 pages after I get home from work, as an example. And then, tally up at the end of the week, because sometimes you are going to get out of line on a daily basis. So you can also make sure that you're just catching up on the week. So now how would I pick the amount of information that I have to go through every week? Well, I would basically just say, okay, well, I registered for the exam and, this date. This gives me, this much time. I want to have, let's say, typically a month and a half, 2 months to review, if necessary. And so then I, take the rest of the time and just, figure out what I need to do per week. Okay, so very straightforward. Okay. Cool. So with that all out of the way, we're going to go over the actual curriculum now. I guess we're 43 minutes in. Oh, geez. Okay. So the actual curriculum content, what do we have here, and what gets covered. So, you can see the topics here. I don't think I'm going to mention this. I will mention some, caveats. So like I said earlier, more contextual on the level 2 versus level 1. Level 3 totally changes the topics, as you can see here, all related to portfolio management. And even really the there's a lot of callbacks to the first and second level at each of these stages. So for example, asset allocation has a lot to do with understanding economics and expected returns. The derivatives and risk management section has a lot to do with your derivatives at level 1 and 2, unsurprisingly. There are some differences, though, between the two. So, for example, your options strategies at level 1 and 2 are pretty much just restricted to normal call and put options, whereas, option strategies at level 3 deal with option combinations. Some brief mention of exotics, but for example, things like Siegel spreads and bear put spreads, for example, dealing with those things. Which also alluded to earlier regarding structure, it's certainly easier to understand why you would buy a, under what economic conditions would you, go long a bear put, for example, if you read asset allocation first. So, just a thing. Okay. Ethics is not exactly the same across the 3 levels. So what you'll notice is maybe 2 main differences. The first of the questions get harder and longer, so you switch over to like more case study and specific questions, which in ethics actually makes it significantly harder. The other thing too, though, with the level 3 is you also get introduced to the asset manager code of conduct, which is pretty much a bit of a nothing burger, to be honest. It's very similar to the code and standards, and if you understand the code and standards, it's the same principles summarized for asset managers. Now you do have some things that you need to note, of course, with the asset manager's code of conduct, which is who does it actually apply to, and what's considered an asset manager. And then maybe additionally, although the JIP standards should probably find a place in ethics, it kind of doesn't. I can't remember which segment it's in. I think performance measurement. But arguably that should be thrown to ethics as well. Well, I guess there's a lot of stuff that JIP standards too about things like time-weighted returns and money-weighted returns, blah blah blah, actually measuring performance. So maybe it doesn't really matter. It's a big mix of both. Whatever. Okay. Cool. Aside from that, I don't think we're going to discuss these levels in detail. You'll definitely see some pretty specific topics. The fixed income between level 1 and level 2 is pretty similar. Equities just gets into more detail. Derivatives is, I think, just very different. So for example, you deal a lot with swaps at level 2, whereas at level 1 you do some very basic swaps, but you don't do like currency swaps, for example. Alternatives, different. Level 2 you focus on a number of specific ones, like timber, for example. We'll discuss that, which certainly doesn't appear on the level 1, I don't think. Portfolio management at both levels is kind of undetailed. Portfolio management at level 1, if I remember correctly, is largely about basically just a Markowitz efficient frontier and developing classical portfolio theory. Whereas level 2 goes into some other calculations of returns, things like factor models, I'm pretty sure. Okay. So there's all that. We'll discuss the details as well, because I'm going to make some comparisons to other content as well. One thing, for example, that's said a lot online is that the curriculum doesn't really cover like it's not useful for insert X topic in finance. I'm going to be honest. You might not get a career in that, but that's probably got a lot more to do with the fact that people don't know it's going to be useful for that area of finance than with it not being useful for that area of finance. So, for example, the fact that there's sections like corporate issuers and financial statement analysis is certainly valuable to investment banking. And I will make a comparison soon, by the way, to Caselli's corporate investment banking to show that, just so you're aware. Okay, now there's also the practical skills modules. These are very cool, actually. I know that some people are complaining about this, but those are the minimalists, so they don't matter. These take probably about 20 hours each. I know the CFA ISO is about 15. It's going to be about 20, at least if you actually want to do the exercise, I would say. And maybe if you don't have familiarity with the topics. I think they're all great. So I did all of them. They're all great. Portfolio management one has a small, I would say a bit of a big problem, actually. I don't like that the person presenting it, I don't think it's a person, actually. I think it might be AI or tech. I don't like that. It's very boring to listen to. And the other problem is that when they're going through, don't get me wrong, this is a great module. This has awesome insights into how to use Excel for portfolio management, and for example, running Monte Carlos with VBA, which is one example, and doing things like back testing in Excel. So very great tips. It's just really hampered by the fact, imagine if I'm like giving a giving a talk about this, for example, and instead of saying, okay, let's see the CFA Curriculum core, for example, I say, okay, cell C2 and cell G2. That's annoying to follow. In this case, not so bad because we only have a couple things up, but if I had like 30 stocks, for example, and instead of just calling them by the stock name or whatever the categorical representation of it is, I refer to the cell name. I don't like that. So, but the other ones are great though. Some of the ones like, so for example, like, the machine learning one, really great for practical usage. It obviously can't go into a lot of depth because there's nothing in the curriculum that's going to teach you how to like earlier I referenced Bayesian inference of multivariate Gaussian distributions. You're not going to learn that. So but practical stuff like I think it goes over random forests, for example, and generating things like that, and setting up like basic neural networks with tensor flow. So okay. Cool. Financial modeling Excel that goes over three-statement financial modeling and creating quick projections with that. Analyst skills is another very interesting one, and this is a very soft skills oriented, but I think it's great. And basically, it's a discussion of how do we pick or how do we create great investment theses. I think is the main takeaway from this one. I think it's great. So this one's great too. It's great. It's just not fun to follow. It's very boring. Okay. Let's go through some of the we'll just take maybe a quick look at this because this video is getting quite long. At the portfolio management pathway. A table of contents here, which you can see starts right here for the official books. So we go over indexing based strategies. This include factors, pooled investments, so things like mutual funds and ETFs, and also the differences between the two, and how ETFs functions with things like authorized participants, blah blah blah. Derivatives based approaches and index based portfolios. Portfolio construction, and this, by the way, is 2026 one, so this table of contents probably wasn't exactly the same as the one that I took, but okay, so portfolio construction, this you can see largely has to do with based on ETFs and / indexes, or your benchmark. So for example, like full replication is just copying the constituent stocks in your benchmark, for example. Etc. Tracking area management, source of return and risk in index-based equity strategies. So basically what you're going to go through, and you can take another look here, and you can just kind of, I'll talk a little bit. You're going to go through equity-based strategies, fixed income-based strategies, event-based strategies. So, for example, activist strategies, things like merger arbitrage, stuff like that. But namely, big focus equity and fixed income portfolios. That's the biggest thing. There should also be a case study at the end. Also stuff like this. So liability driven and index based strategies. Now you see reference to like I alluded to earlier. I won't go back to it in the equity based strategies as well indexes, and you can't get away from that. That's obvious. Yield curve strategies would be under the fixed income type strategies as well. Liability driven. largely like very much related to fixed income instruments, but it's really about, as you can see here, doing things for institutional investors like pension plans. And making sure that instead of focusing on returns, you focus on managing liabilities. So, for example, you might need to, have a certain amount of your, say like your accounts, if you're an insurance company, held in fixed income instruments to cover the variance, because fixed income is generally lower variance than equities, and so you can't necessarily handle that variance in certain accounts because of liquidity needs. If you're an insurance company, for example. Okay. Cool. Credit strategies, trade strategies. Oh, actually, I guess it's worth mentioning. Less so. I mean, there's two sections in the curriculum that I went through on trading. So there is the one in the portfolio management section. And there's also one in, let's see here. I think in portfolio construction is where the other trading section is. But basically one is about basically benchmarking and pricing, returns with trading, and the other is largely focused on the technology with trading and how do firms, for example, gain advantage by reducing, for example, the distance between them and the exchange and picking certain materials over others. Whereas the other section is, as I mentioned, largely focused on things like the VWAP. There it is. Benchmarks. So, okay. Cool. And then you end up with a case study, I think 2 or 3 case studies. Okay, so there's that. Now, some just comparisons for detail. So basically I have 2 sections from Stefano Caselli's book, Corporate Finance and Investment Banking, or maybe Corporate Investment Banking, whatever the title actually is, and some from Romer's Advanced Macroeconomics, just to show some comparisons in detail. Long video. Okay, so this, for example, is the CFA program, Level 2, 2024, on economics. So just for, comparison in terms of, first, you'll notice when I go and flip over to the, Romer's Macroeconomics on the same topic for, that page, much more mathematical detail there. You do get some things like rate of change here, for example, that get discussed, and this is, I believe, just a discussion of, well, this is obviously growth models. I think this is the solo growth model, perhaps maybe expanded, right? But you see, it discusses things like elasticity and the growth rate of the total factor productivity, and it discusses, it says that there's an equilibrium sustainable growth rate, right? And so you get the equilibrium rate down here. Now, if we flip over to Romer's, though, basically the difference here is that you switch over from being, for example, given equations to understand the equilibrium rate of growth to using calculus to solve it. That's pretty much the main difference. So you end up with obviously a lot more mathematical rigor, and also I think a better understanding of the equilibrium in the first place. So, for example, you in Romer's Macroeconomics, Advanced Macroeconomics, will go over things like conceptually convex optimization, not the same thing, but to get your equilibrium potentials. And, understanding the difference between convex and concave economic functions, and how you draw an equilibrium from there, what equilibrium actually means. So lots more math, a lot more derivations there. In the CFA curriculum, a lot less for that, I would say. And the math's easier to read for sure, but well, maybe the math itself isn't easier to read because you do have to read a lot more English to understand what's going on. But it's easier to follow, I think, than in Romer's book, at least, unless you know calculus, like Calc 1. So yeah. Okay, now discussing, for example, a comparison to an investment banking book. Here is the CFA curriculum, for example, and it goes over a case study here on restructuring. You see that it's about, I think it's another like page or two, right? So I guess something like 7-8 pages. And now if we go over to Caselli's book on basically the same topics, this is restructuring. People say it's quote unquote not useful for investment banking. I'm just pulling one segment from Caselli's book. It's arguably more detailed than Caselli's book on the same topic. You do get more. You kind of get the same mix of financial statements as you can see here, but the text itself is not. I don't think in the case study here as detailed, and maybe even has less explanatory power in some respects. So I think that the CFA curriculum does a better job of conveying certain topics like this. And then I also wanted to pull up Caselli's on distressed valuations here, basically just to say, the CFA curriculum basically just says the same thing about a lot of topics like distressed valuations, for example, and situations like that. Now, this shouldn't be a total surprise because, as I had mentioned at, sometime earlier in the video, I'm totally losing track now that we're past an hour. You can use more words to describe a topic. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to say more. And I think the CFA curriculum on the conceptual front probably just says as much as needs to be said. Perhaps even of all of business except marketing and obviously things like business intelligence that it doesn't deal with. So, but all things in finance, I think it covers the conceptual very well. Obviously, I don't even have anything on quant finance up here, but obviously if you open up a quant finance book, you're going to immediately notice that it's much more, requires a much greater math background than the CFA curriculum requires. So, for example, quant finance is obviously going to require you to understand calculus and linear algebra. Probability as well. Stochastic calculus / Ito calculus as well. You can benefit from measure theory. I don't think it's a strict necessity though. So anyways, whereas the CFA Level 1, or say the CFA curriculum generally, I would say doesn't even really require calculus. And even if you don't have a statistics background, the summation notation and product notations can both be picked up probably very quickly. So yeah, but a lot of conceptual stuff. But obviously you do need to do some math, and the questions you get asked are there's no way you're going to do finance without understanding some math. Okay, cool. So that's my review of the curriculum. You can ask me other questions if you feel I haven't answered certain things. I'd be happy to respond to those questions and hopefully give a good answer. Otherwise, like and subscribe, and we'll do another video eventually. Okay, bye.